Dick Hoyt was what thought was going to be a typical father when his son Rick Hoyt was born. But he got some interesting news as his son was born, and the doctor says, your son has some major disabilities, and very unpastoral of this doctor, and even wrong of this doctor, says you might as well just place him into an institution. He's never going to function like a normal human being in any way. You might as well just place him into an institution because he's going to be, in essence, a vegetable the rest of his life. But Mr. Hoyt and his wife decided that wasn't the approach that they were going to take. They were going to raise him like any other child. And it didn't take them very long as Rick got older for them to recognize that their son, though he couldn't speak and though he couldn't walk and he couldn't move really much on his own, they decided that they're going to send him to school because they could recognize that he understands when he's being talked to. He's processing, he's thinking, he's smiling. And they got him a computer that made it so he could speak and so he could communicate with them. And as he grew up and as he went through school, he learned of a benefit run. It was a 5-mile benefit run, and Rick couldn't run himself, but he wanted to participate. So he went to his dad, who was not a runner. In fact, had a heart condition himself. But because his father loved his son, he decided, I'll do it. I'll run this 5-mile benefit run for the sake of my son. Now, when I say he decided to run it for his son, what he was committing to wasn't to running it by himself, but he was going to push his son in his wheelchair for 5 miles. It's hard enough for me to run 5 miles, let alone pushing a wheelchair. But after they got done with that run, Rick said to his dad, he said, "Dad, when we run, I feel like my disability disappears." And so it was from that moment on that their story, as many people, millions of people in the world now know, their story really began to take shape, because that 5-mile run turned into another one and another one and another one, which eventually turned to marathons, which turned to triathlons, which turned to Ironman triathlons. And just to give you a little perspective as to what that looked like, when they would do their triathlons, Dick, the father, would take a raft. He would place his son in the raft, and he would swim, pulling a raft. And then when they got done with the swimming portion, he would pick up his son out of the raft, and he would place him on a custom-made bike, put his son on a bike, and he would pedal, and his son rode in the front of the bike. And then when they got done biking, then they would begin to run while his dad pushed his wheelchair. Now, what an Ironman triathlon is, for a little more perspective, is with swimming with a raft behind, and with biking with a person on the front, and with running by pulling a wheelchair. Dick would swim 2.5 miles. When he was done swimming 2.5 miles, he would get out and bike 112 miles. And when he was done biking 112 miles, he would run an entire 26-mile marathon, all in one race with another individual. Now, if there's not I can't think hardly of a better story of determination. And the motivation for this father, for his determination, was the love for his son. And as of 2008, for a little bit more perspective, and this was still taking place as of 2008, Dick was 66 years old. And at that point, they had participated in 950 races. And of those 950 races, 60 of them were marathons, 200 of them were triathlons, and 6 of them were Ironmans. It's a story that's inspired millions across the world, because they see not just the story, but what they actually see is the determination of a father that's motivated by the love for his son. See, what's amazing about the story is that determination can be seen. When you see this story, true determination can be seen. I have gone through seasons in my life where I guess I would say it's kind of tough to say I was determined for anything when you put it in the perspective of the Hoyt team. There's seasons that I've been determined for various things. Maybe it was a high school degree or college degree, or maybe it was some athletic goals that I had. Maybe it was various reading pursuits, or maybe it was a relational determination, such as the pursuit of a spouse. It took her a while to come along, but she came along. And in that pursuit, it was abundantly obvious to everybody around me that I was determined for something. I was determined to have a relationship with this certain girl, and the determination was seen. It was seen when we would we want to go out for another date, and I would go check my bank account, and I'd recognize that I have $6.50 because I have gone on so many other dates. So I thought, we can still pull one off. Let's go to Sonic, dollar menu. We can still go out. True story. We actually did that on multiple occasions. Or the determination was seen when there was just the time and the energy spent, so much so that to the point where there was a number of occasions, not that many, so this is part confession, but also mainly illustration, is where we would cut class so we could go and we could spend some time with each other. See, determination can be seen. And I suppose there's probably also seasons where I can look at my life and just say, I wasn't determined for anything. I wasn't really doing much. There wasn't much that could really be seen from me. So the question is, if people were to look at your life, where would they see the determination? What would the objects of your determination be? You know, if I'm to think, look at my friends, or if I'm to look at my own life, different examples may come to mind. Maybe sometimes our greatest determination is to finish binging that Netflix series. Maybe for some it's, I got to get my home perfectly landscaped. Maybe some it's to finish your education, to get that promotion, to win that girl, to win that game, to make that team, to get to retirement, to get through another day. I don't know what it is, but when somebody else might look at your life, where can determination be seen? And what is the object of that determination? And as I reflected on this subject of being determined to do something, I was actually just talking to Sarah, and this kind of flew out of my mouth, and as I thought about it, I'm like, well, that's true. Determination can be seen, and it can be seen because when you are determined, you are going to use whatever it is at your disposal to be effective, which is another key word, for the cause of your determination. You're going to use whatever you have, whatever you can do, whatever courage you can muster, whatever strength that you have, whatever resources that you have available in order to be effective for what it is that you are determined for. So if you really are to reflect on your life, what is it that's the cause of your determination, or is there any there as of today? Last week, many of our life groups, as we're wrapping up, we've just got 1 week left as we've been walking through the book of Acts, but we've had many encounters with the Apostle Paul. And this last week, we talked a little bit about just generally the Apostle Paul. What was it that inspired us about him? What is it that, as he was an example, we want to be like? What is it that he did that are some of the greatest attributes? And for me, it's this word determination. Paul was determined. He was determined to serve Jesus. He was determined to tell other people about Jesus, motivated by the love that Jesus first had for him. He was determined to love God. He was determined to serve Jesus with everything that he had. Now, our text for last week, or for this week, we're actually going to kind of take a high-level view where we can see from Acts 21, 22, 23, 24, and 25, there are different glimpses that we can get of Paul that we can see that he was determined. Because through this scene, as we ended last week, we ended with Paul was before the Ephesian elders, and as he comes to these men, he's about to part ways with them and not see them again. He makes this statement. He says, "The Holy Spirit tells me that every town that I go to, that I face threat, I face imprisonment, I face persecution." And yet Paul continued to preach. He continued to press forward to serve Jesus. And as he parts ways, he said, "I'm going to Jerusalem." And many people, not necessarily the Ephesian elders, but here a little bit later, tried to discourage him from doing that. "No, don't do that. You're going to be put in prison. You're going to be killed. Don't go there." And Paul knew that is exactly what was going to happen. And sure enough, it wasn't very long after Paul entered into Jerusalem that a riot starts. They arrest him. They drag him before the Roman officials where they place him on trial. The Romans don't quite know what to do with him because as they're about to, what they would do is they would beat somebody to get the truth out of them. Kind of a different approach than we take today. But that's what they would do because they assumed that Paul was doing something wrong. Because he had caused such a riot, such a ruckus amongst the Jewish people, they assumed that he was at fault for something. So what they were going to do is they were going to beat him until he confessed what it was that he did. But as they were about to begin to beat him, to flog him like they did Jesus, Paul says, "Is it legal for you to beat a Roman citizen?" And the answer was no. They didn't know that Paul was a Roman citizen. But of the day, if you beat a Roman citizen without a fair trial, you were in deep trouble as a Roman authority. You were in deep trouble. So they didn't know what to do with them. And so what they do is they say, well, this seems to be a Jewish issue. Let's send him to the Jewish authorities, the Sanhedrin. And as we're going to see, he gets out of that situation too, and he kind of stumps them, and he's standing before trial with them. And so the Romans send him back to Governor Felix, and he stands trial before Governor Felix. And then Festus becomes the successor of Felix, and he has trial before Festus. And all throughout this process, as he is chained, as he's being drugged from trial to trial, as he's being questioned, even though he is innocent, he's being accused of doing wrong. All the way throughout there, he continues to be determined to serve Jesus and to preach Jesus. So from this text, there are just 3 examples that we're going to take a little bit of a different approach, but there are a number of examples that we can see Paul's determination, but there are 3 that we can see on a repeated basis that we're just going to pull out a few examples. First is we can see Paul's determination in his intentionality. We can see the way that Paul is determined because the way that he speaks, where he goes, what he does is on purpose. It's not by accident. He intentionally steps in to some of these various situations, and he uses even the difficult ones in order to preach again. So the Romans, as he's first arrested in Jerusalem, the Romans have him confused for somebody else. So in verse 38, let's start there. They ask Paul, "Aren't you the Egyptian who led a rebellion some time ago and took 4,000 members of the assassins out into the desert?" Paul says, "No." "No, I am a Jew and a citizen of Tarsus in Cilicia, which is an important city. Please let me talk to these people." The commander agreed, so Paul stood on the stairs and motioned to the people to be quiet. Soon a deep silence enveloped the crowd, and he addressed them in their own language, Aramaic. "Brothers and esteemed fathers," Paul said, "listen to me as I offer my defense." When they heard him speaking their own language, the silence was even greater. Now, just one question, I'm kind of baffled. First, there was a deep silence. I'm not sure what's deeper than a deep silence, but apparently they got quieter here. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, and I was brought up and educated here in Jerusalem under Gamaliel. As his student, I was carefully trained in our own Jewish laws and customs. I became very zealous to honor God in everything I did, just like all of you today, and I persecuted the followers of the way," that's Christians, "hounding some to death, arresting both men and women and throwing them in prison. The high priest and the whole council of elders can testify that this is so, for I received letters from them to our Jewish brothers in Damascus, authorizing me to bring the Christians from there to Jerusalem in chains to be punished." So what Paul does is he addresses this crowd, and he begins by building common ground. And he does so intentionally for a purpose to tell his own story, to tell about Jesus. The first thing he does is, though Paul could speak a variety of languages, he chooses to speak Aramaic right within their own native tongue, so that way it would get their attention, and clearly it did. It says the crowds grew even more quiet when they realized that he was speaking their language. But then he began to build more common ground, and he says, "I'm a Jew just like all of you. These are the Asian Jews." And he says, I'm a Jew. We have common ground here. We're on the same team. And then he goes a step further, and to prop up his credibility, he quotes his leader, Gamaliel. Gamaliel was a rabbi of the day that was highly respected, probably by everybody there. They would understand, "You were trained by him? He's your teacher? He's your rabbi?" And with each statement that he makes, he's building this common ground, but then he goes even further. And here he is being persecuted as a follower of the way. He's being a Christian. He follows Jesus. And then he starts out with saying, "I too once persecuted Christians. I too once arrested them, put them in prison. I even murdered some of them." He's just building this common ground. He does so to then proceed and to tell his own story. He built this common ground on purpose, for the purpose of telling his story of how he came to be a follower of Jesus himself. But even though he does that, he builds common ground, he does not shy away from the very reason that they hate him. Because there is a major theological difference. There's a major belief difference between Paul and these Jews. And it's the very foundation of God's heart was not just for one particular nation. God's heart was for the world. Because as Paul finishes his story, as he finishes telling how he became a follower of Jesus and building this common ground, he ends with one word that sets the crowd on fire. If they were starting a riot before, they were really starting one now. And he ends with one word, and it's the word Gentiles. And what he says there is that God's heart isn't just for Jews. It's not just for Israel. But it's actually for the entire world, including those who are not Jewish. And it's that very point that he wants to make, and it's that very point that Jesus came. And that Paul has this opportunity to preach the gospel, but it's also that very point that Paul gets himself in trouble once again. He was not afraid yet to go there. Paul was determined, and he spoke intentionally as evidence of that. He intentionally shared the gospel. He intentionally developed common ground with them. The second thing that you can see from some of these texts that we can see as evidence of Paul's determination is that Paul pursued innocence. He always was pursuing to do what was right, and we can see that in chapter 24 as he's before now at the very end of one of the last trials. He's before Felix, and they're still not quite sure what to do with him. And so the Jews and Paul, they both are before Felix, and they're making their case. And the Jewish leaders have made their accusations against Paul. The accusation is disorderly conduct. The Romans hated riots. They hated disorder. They hated chaos. And so they would squash even a sniff of rebellion. And so what the Jews accused Paul of falsely was creating riots. It's ironic. They were the ones creating the riot. So they're there. They accuse him of disorderly conduct. The Jews have made their case before Felix. But then Paul steps in for his defense. The governor then motioned for Paul to speak. Paul said, "I know, sir, that you have been a judge of Jewish affairs for many years, so I gladly present my defense before you. You can quickly discover that I arrived in Jerusalem no more than 12 days ago to worship at the temple." That was his purpose. He came to worship. "My accusers never found me arguing with anyone in the temple, nor stirring up a riot in any synagogue or on the streets of the city. These men cannot prove the things they accused me of doing. But I admit that I follow the way which they call a cult. I worship the God of our ancestors, and I firmly believe the Jewish law and everything written in the prophets. I have the same hope in God that these men have, that He will raise both the righteous and the unrighteous. Here's the point. Because of this, I always try to maintain a clear conscience before God and all the people. See, Paul's conscience was clear. Paul knew that all the way through this journey, as he is preaching Jesus, he wants the credibility of all people. He's not going to do something that's going to get him in trouble and therefore lose his influence. He also certainly, and this one is perhaps a bit more obvious, is that because his very pursuit is to honor and to serve Jesus, he is innocent of dishonoring God in the journey. For what he is preaching actually came out of the Jews. This is a different subject for another time. But Paul didn't start something new in the sense of something separate from the Jewish people, but Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. This is who the Jews should have been looking for. And out of that comes the true Israel, the people that honor Jesus as their king. So Paul is determined, and he's dead set on pursuing innocence. He wasn't going to do anything that discredited him. His goal was to influence within the culture. And so he wasn't going to do something, just for example, he wasn't going to just be a jerk for being a jerk's sake. He was going to look for opportunities to preach Jesus in a way that both the Romans and the Jews alike, and it's very interesting here, as we're going to see next week, is that the Romans actually liked Paul. Even though Paul should have been a problem to them, and he was a problem to them over and over again because the Jews kept stirring up trouble, the Romans liked them. Because Paul tried to earn the favor, not just of God, but also of man. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says this to his disciples. Jesus knew that these days were coming. He knew that the disciples were going to be drugged before the Sanhedrin. He knew they were going to be drugged before the Roman authorities, and that they were going to be persecuted, that they were going to be placed on trial. And he says as much in verse 17 of this passage. But before he says this, he gives them the command. He says, here's what I want you to act like. Here's what I want your behavior to be. He says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes. And the second, and as innocent as doves. What Paul does here is he points out that he was above reproach. He couldn't be accused of anything. He was innocent. And it's the same thing for us. An example is when we're living out in the world, when we're living to be an example of the world, when we're being the light of the world, when we're being the salt of the earth, we're to live above reproach, that somebody can't accuse us. They can try, but no fault can be found. Paul was pursuing a ministry that was as innocent as a dove. But then there's the second part, the idea of being shrewd as snakes, and Paul's determination can be seen in his shrewd actions. In the Learner's Dictionary defines what shrewd means. It's not a word that we use very often, but it's simply having or showing an ability to understand things and to make good judgments. Having or showing an ability to understand things and to make good judgments. Basically, it's being mentally sharp. It's understanding what's around you. It's understanding the culture that we live in. It's understanding how systems work. It's understanding how the world works, so that way you know how to operate and to have an influence within it. Paul shows this on a number of occasions. There's a couple I would like to go to. We simply don't have time. But the one that I find quite comical actually comes when Paul is on trial before the Sanhedrin, when he's before the Jewish authorities. That's in chapter 23, just verses 6 through 10 here. Paul realized that some members of the high council were Sadducees and some were Pharisees. So he shouted, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, as were my ancestors." There's that common ground thing again. "And I'm on trial because my hope is in the resurrection of the dead. And with saying that statement, the resurrection of the dead, he divides that council that he's on trial before in two. This divided the council, the Pharisees against the Sadducees. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection or angels or spirits, but the Pharisees believe in all of these. So there was a great uproar. Some of the teachers of religious law who were Pharisees jumped up and began to argue forcefully. "We see nothing wrong with him," they shouted. "Perhaps a spirit or an angel actually spoke to him." As the conflict grew more violent, the Roman commander, was afraid they would tear Paul apart, so he ordered his soldiers to go and rescue him by force and take him back to the fortress. Paul knows that he's not going to get a fair trial with these guys. He knows that they're going to make nothing but false accusations. And so what Paul does, he makes an extremely shrewd move. He understands the different backgrounds these guys have. He understands the different beliefs that they have. And so what he does is he actually takes the very center of what he's been preaching all the way throughout the book of Acts, the resurrection of the dead, the resurrection of Jesus, and he uses that apex, that central point of his message, and he uses it to divide this group to the point where they couldn't be unified in accusations against him. And because they couldn't be unified in accusations against him, neither could the Romans. Because the Romans had brought Paul back to the Jewish authorities to say, okay, let's see what they have to say. Let's see if there's any truth to the accusations that they're making. Let's see if there's anything consistent. Let's see if we can find a fault with him. And yet Paul divides them straight down the middle because the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees didn't. And so as Paul says the word, they care more about their arguments being right than they cared about their purpose with Paul before them or not. In fact, the Pharisees who opposed Jesus the most becomes Paul's advocate. They come to save the day for Paul. There's nothing wrong with them, and they actually open the door to, well, maybe an angel appeared to him. Maybe he got a message. Well, yeah, he did. It's called Jesus. But it's also interesting and something not to learn from the Pharisees and the Sadducees is because their goal was united in stopping Paul. All Paul had to do is throw out a theological difference in between them, and they killed themselves. Which tells us this, that these Jewish leaders, they cared more about being right about their beliefs than they really cared about what was true. They cared more about their position than they really cared about looking for what was actually true. I think there's something Christians can learn from that as well. What Paul does here is he shrewdly, as Mark Moore says, he shrewdly adopts a divide and conquer mentality. He gets them so divided that they can't come up with a unified decision themselves. That was a shrewd move. He understood the context he was in. He understood their different perspectives, and he threw a bomb in there that actually gets him out of Dodge, out of trial, and on to the next one, thus giving him more opportunities to continue to preach. The lesson for us here is that Christians, we need to be shrewd, we need to be wise. We need to know what we're dealing with. We need to be smarter, shrewder, and wiser than the culture of this world. We need to be what I used to say in youth ministry, we have got one heck of a meat computer in between our ears. And we need to be just as good of stewards as that as anything else that we have in this life. I mean, we have a whole lot of opportunity right between our ears. We need to learn to use our minds in order to be shrewd. But here is really why this subject of being determined is so important. It's so important because the object of your determination determines your fulfillment in life. The object of your determination determines your fulfillment in life. And the object of your determination serves as a witness to others. Now that may sound like a preacher statement, like an overstatement, like, okay, come on now. No, really, we need to think about it just a little bit. The object of our determination determines our fulfillment in life. Sometimes I wonder about, and I've actually heard this discussion about Olympic athletes. Olympic athletes spend their entire life, their diet, their workout program, they sacrifice their family, they designate everything for one purpose, to win an Olympic gold medal. So the question is, what happens when you achieve that? What happens when they get that gold medal? Now what? Emptiness. Emptiness. There's nothing left to achieve. You've achieved your life goal. Or how about those who pursue fame and fortune? If your goal is to get lots of money or to be really famous, what happens when you have lots of money or when you become famous? Emptiness. And you know that to be true because, and I've said this before, if we just begin to look at different lives of celebrities who have lots of money, who have achieved great fame, what happens to many of them? They've got to pursue something else. They've got to have a new high. They've got to have a new goal, which often turns to other destructive behaviors, such as drugs, alcohol. And ultimately, it leads to emptiness and destruction of the very life. The very thing that they've had their entire life bent on becomes their greatest destruction in life. But how about if our one pursuit, if our determination is to live for and to serve Jesus, the King of this world? So what happens is we experience life abundantly on this earth and life eternally in the next. There is no apex on this side of heaven. And to come to Jesus, the author of life, and to live the way that He calls us to, is to live as we were designed and we were created to, and therefore experience the abundant life. See, Paul was an example of what it looked like to be determined on the most important thing that gives life and life abundantly. Paul demonstrated what it looks like to fulfill the great commandment. Jesus said in Matthew 22 and in Mark chapter 12, He said, every law and command, everything within this book, it hangs on two commands, and the very first one is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength, is to love God with absolutely everything that you have. And if you love God with absolutely everything that you have, you're determined. You're determined to live as God wants you to. But before we move on from that too quickly, sometimes we have a tendency to kind of naturally, we pull some of these components out. If we can just kind of lump heart and soul together here and have that mean emotion, and then we've got mind and strength. Sometimes we're people that are really good with loving God with our emotion, but if we just love God with our emotion, we just have mindless passion. If we just love God with just our strength, it results in brutality. It results in things like the Crusades. People just think they can have strength and they can go out and they can conquer the world and everybody will love Jesus. That's never worked, by the way. If you just love God with your strength, it just results in brutality. And if you just love God with your mind, it results in unrelatable truth. But if you have all three, if you love God with all of your emotion, with all of your mind, with all of your strength, it results in an abundant life and a fierce testimony that's worth following. A fierce person that's worth following. So the question for us then comes, where do you need to direct your determination? How do you need to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength? And if we were just to look at just some of these examples from Paul and we were to compare those to our lives and ask the question of how can our determination to live for Jesus be seen in our intentionality, in our innocence, in our shrewdness? Let's just dive into that just a little bit more. Do you make decisions on your day-to-day life? Not every once in a while, but do you make decisions in your day-to-day life, not based on what you want, not based on what your family wants, not based on what the culture wants, but do you make decisions in your day-to-day life based on the way that Jesus would live your life if He was living it for you? Are you living intentionally? when you take your kids to school, or when you pick your kids up from school, when they come home from school, are you intentional with the way that you want to train them? Do they think that you care more about their homework, or do they think that you care more about Jesus? Our oldest started kindergarten this past week, and I certainly have not gotten even close, you can ask my wife, to everything right when it comes to parenting. But there are some examples that I've been able to follow, people that were determined to follow Jesus, that sparked the idea with me of how can I be intentional with my daughter as I drive her to school. It's simply challenging her to be Jesus, and then before she ever gets out of my car and I drop her off, they're at Northwest Elementary School. And I don't have to say anything. I mean, we've only done it a couple days. I don't have to say anything more. I just turn around and put my hand in the back seat. She puts her hands in mine. She knows it's prayer time. And that number one prayer is not that she be kept safe. It's not that everything would go smoothly for her. The number one prayer is that people would see Jesus in the way that she lives, even at 5 years old. Because we all know that our public school systems need that more than anything. Need to see Jesus in a practical way. The way that you parent, the way that you live, the way that you make life decisions, are you intentionally making those based off your love for Jesus? Or how about in the area of innocence? Is your determination to serve Jesus seen in the way that you want to live completely above reproach? Let's just think about the gray areas. You know, those areas that, you could go either way. You could either act that way or you could not act that way, and it really wouldn't be that big of a deal either direction. In the gray areas of your life, which direction do you lean? Do you lean towards the way of, I have the freedom to do that, or do you lean towards the area of being above reproach? Small examples. When everybody else takes 5 minutes longer on a lunch break, because you want to live a life above reproach, or you just, an example, when everybody else within as you're eating lunch with is gossiping or talking about another person. In those moments, do you step in, or do you try to live a life that's above reproach, that's above accusation? When it comes to the idea of being shrewd, this is closely related to the idea of being intentional. But have you studied? Do you understand culture? Do you know what you deal with on a day-to-day basis well enough that you can live wisely? Not just uselessly, not just passionately, but can you think about that question I said at the very beginning of how is it that you're living for Jesus to be effective? Not just merely passionate, but how are you living down with your mind and being shrewd in the way that you live? Sarah and I were talking about this, she reminded me of one of her college professors that had a high school student at the time, and his son wanted to go to a movie that wasn't exactly the most appropriate movie, wasn't exactly the cleanest movie. And so what her professor did, his name was Peter Buckland, what Peter did is he went to his son and said, okay, you can go to the movie on 2 occasions. I'm going with you. And number 2, we're going to talk about it afterwards. Now, when I look back at that, I'm like, what a shrewd move. What a wise move. Because in that moment, he didn't bunker him and save him from all the evil of the world. Rather, what he did was he stepped into it, acted innocently within it, and taught him out of it in order to know what he was dealing with within the world that he lived. That's what shrewdness looks like. Now, when we talk about the subject of determination, and frankly, a lot of the discussions that we've seen all the way throughout the book of Acts can be rather daunting. It can be rather frightening. I'm supposed to tell people about Jesus. I'm supposed to be a witness. I'm supposed to be out in my culture. That's scary. And sometimes we don't even know where to start. That's where the beauty of the church comes in, is this is not a you thing. This is an us thing. We're walking through this level of determination together. Arguably, Paul, as the author, writes in Hebrews chapter 10, and let us consider how to spur one another on to love and good deeds. Let us consider how to spur one another on in love and good deeds. And to do that, he says this, let us not neglect meeting together. Let us not neglect meeting together as some have the habit of doing. See, it's not about just going to church. It's about being the church together. And if you're not present, you can't be spurred on, nor can you spur on. When people just choose, like, I don't really feel like getting up there, you're shorting the church, and you're shorting yourself. You can't be spurred on, you can't spur on somebody else. Rather, let us encourage one another, and all the more as we see the day of the Lord's return approaching. This is an us thing. And I can't help but wonder, it's because determination is seen. Determination is inspiring to those around us, not just to our brothers and sisters in Christ, but it's also inspiring to those that see us out in the world. Team Hoyt's story is it's certainly an inspiring one because you see a father who so desperately and passionately loves his son. But you know, the story of the church isn't that much further, because we have a greater Father who loved his son, but he gave him as a ransom. He gave him as a price for all the sins of the world. The question is the story that we're living, are we living in such a way that we are determined to tell that story of a father who loved his son, but didn't love his son so much that he wouldn't give him for the entire world? That whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. See, a determined, Christ-centered life inspires others to follow you as you follow Christ. So how is it that you need to begin to have your eyes dead set, fixed on Jesus, that you are determined to live like him, walk like him, serve like him, love like him, become like him? So that way people can see the way that we are intentional in the way that we live. We're above reproach and cannot be accused of anything. And we are on fire for Jesus. How are you living in such a way that people can see your determination and see Jesus living in you? Let's pray. God, you're good. And God, as you know, as I reflected on some of these points myself, there's been times in my life where I have done better than I do today. God, I pray for myself and the same prayer for all of Cornerstone Christian Church, that we would not allow ourselves to get stuck in rhythms or stuck in what we have to do, but God, we would have our eyes firmly planted on you. That way we would live life that is intentionally to serve you. God, that we would live a life that is above reproach, that cannot be accused of doing wrong, but is one that reflects being the light of the world and salt of the earth. And God, would you help us to utilize our minds to live shrewdly, to understand our culture, to be able to live wisely, that we can love other people so much that we would understand what they're walking through in life, and that we could speak in a way that they would understand, and they'd be able to see your Son, Jesus, clearly in the way that we live and the way that we speak. I pray all this in your Son's name.